What happened inside this laundry room after the recording ended was not captured. Around 10 p.m. on May 10, 2026, 19-year-old University of Washington student Juniper Blessing was doing laundry inside Nordheim Court, an apartment complex used by students in Seattle. Only a short time later, another resident would find her unresponsive on the floor. Juniper was a sophomore studying atmospheric science with additional interests in music and philosophy, but on that Sunday evening, she was simply inside the apartment laundry room finishing an ordinary task. Earlier that evening, another female resident had entered the laundry room and held the door for a man she did not know. That man was later identified by prosecutors as 31-year-old Christopher Michael Leahy. He stayed only briefly before leaving, but roughly 15 minutes later, he appeared in the laundry room again, while Juniper and another resident were still there. Eventually, the other resident left, leaving Juniper alone. Shortly afterward, the Wise camera stopped recording, and investigators later discovered that its power cord had been disconnected. Prosecutors allege Leahy had noticed the camera and deliberately cut its power before attacking Juniper, although the attack itself was never recorded. Interestingly, unplugging the camera did not erase what had already been captured. The device contained an SD card, and investigators were eventually able to recover the footage stored on it. Not long after the camera went dark, another resident encountered a man matching Leahy's description leaving the area. She then entered the laundry room and discovered Juniper badly injured before calling 911 at around 10:10 p.m. By the time Seattle police arrived, Juniper had died from extensive blood loss after suffering more than 40 stab wounds. She was killed on Mother's Day inside the apartment complex where she lived. At first, detectives did not have a publicly identified suspect. However, evidence inside the laundry room began pointing them toward the man captured on the camera. A fingerprint recovered from residue on the laundry room door was later matched to Leahy, and investigators also learned that he had apparently been seen around the surrounding neighborhood in the days before the killing. According to prosecutors, he had also been following a different female student at Nordheim Court earlier that same evening.
We now know he was in this area, which makes sense to me since he had been at University Prep.
During that time, I think anyone can just walk into it, just pop the door open. It's ridiculous. I just wish they really released more information about the guy.
3 days after Juniper's death, Seattle police released still images taken directly from the recovered laundry room recording. Those images quickly produced tips, including information from people who recognized Leahy. Later that same day, an attorney contacted Bellevue police, and Leahy eventually turned himself in while accompanied by family members. He was arrested and charged with first-degree premeditated murder, with bail set at $10 million. Despite Juniper being a transgender woman, investigators said they found no evidence that her gender identity motivated the killing. There was also no known relationship between Juniper and Leahy. Instead, authorities have described her as an apparently random victim, leaving no publicly established motive for why she was attacked that night. The case did not immediately move toward trial.
I just want to know they are killing people randomly or just they have some beef between them, because if they just pick some people randomly, I think it's really scared.
I already try not to let people I don't know into my apartment building, but maybe I'll be more conscious of that next time and keeping windows closed.
After concerns were raised about Leahy's mental condition, a state psychiatric evaluator determined that he was not competent to understand the proceedings or properly assist in his own defense. By late June 2026, a judge had accepted that finding and ordered him to undergo competency restoration treatment at Western State Hospital. As a result, no plea had been entered, and the murder case was effectively paused while doctors worked to determine whether he could eventually become competent to stand trial. As of the latest information available in the research, Leahy remained in the competency process, with another review expected in September 2026. The camera never recorded what happened after its power was cut, but the footage it had already saved, including the man prosecutors accused of killing Juniper, survived on the SD card and became part of the evidence used to identify him. Robert Brooks was still handcuffed behind his back when officers brought him into this medical examination room at Marcy Correctional Facility in New York. What happened over the next several minutes would eventually lead to criminal charges against 10 correctional officers. And remarkably, much of the evidence came from cameras that had never been properly activated. 4 officers inside the room were wearing body cameras that evening. However, none of them had switched their cameras into active recording mode. Ordinarily, that might have meant there was no recording of what followed. But the devices were still powered on in standby mode, and they silently preserved video of the encounter anyway, and there was no audio. What survived was the visual record. According to the investigation, Brooks was repeatedly punched and kicked while his hands remained restrained behind his back. The footage also documented pressure being applied around his neck, along with other strikes as several staff members stood inside or moved through the room. Rather than replaying those moments here, what matters for the case is what the recordings later proved. Brooks was largely restrained throughout the encounter, and the violence shown on camera was far more extensive than the first official account suggested. Robert Brooks was 43 years old and serving a 12-year sentence when he was transferred from Mohawk Correctional Facility to Marcy on December 9, 2024. Later that evening, he was taken into the infirmary, where the body cam footage was recorded. Initial staff reports claimed force had become necessary after Brooks became irate. Once investigators recovered the silent video, however, that explanation came under immediate scrutiny. By the time Brooks was taken from the facility to Wynn Hospital in Utica, his injuries were severe. He had suffered trauma to his head, neck, torso, internal organs, and other parts of his body, and he had also aspirated blood. Unfortunately, doctors were unable to save him. Robert Brooks was pronounced dead at approximately 3:52 the following morning. The medical examiner later determined that Brooks died from compression of the neck, combined with multiple blunt force injuries. His death was ruled a homicide. By then, investigators were also comparing the body cam footage with the written reports submitted after the incident, and those records created another problem. Investigators found that some of the official use of force reports did not match what the cameras had recorded. Evidence also emerged that blood had been cleaned from the area afterward, while several staff members who were present had failed to intervene. Eventually, 14 employees, including officers, supervisors, and a nurse, were suspended and later terminated or otherwise forced out. On December 27th, a little over 2 weeks after Brooks died, the New York Attorney General's office publicly released the recovered body cam recordings. The videos had no sound because the cameras had never been actively switched on. Still, the images were enough to show the public what had happened inside that medical room, and eventually they became central evidence in a criminal investigation involving 10 correctional officers. Over the following year, several officers pleaded guilty to manslaughter or related offenses. Nicholas Anzalone and Anthony Farina each received 22-year prison sentences after pleading guilty to first-degree manslaughter, while Christopher Walrath received 15 years. Other defendants received lesser sentences after resolving their cases through guilty pleas, but not everyone admitted wrongdoing. In October 2025, David Kingsley was convicted at trial of second-degree murder and first-degree manslaughter. He was later sentenced to 25 years to life. At the same trial, however, Matthew Gallagher and Nicholas Kiefer were acquitted of all charges. As for Michael Fisher, who had been accused of failing to intervene, his trial ended with a hung jury before he eventually pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor reckless endangerment charge. By early 2026, the final criminal case connected to Brooks's death had been resolved. The consequences also extended beyond the officers in that room. New York accelerated the deployment of body cameras across its prison system. Leadership at Marcy was changed, and an independent review was eventually commissioned into broader problems within the Department of Corrections. That review later identified concerns involving use of force, weak accountability, inadequate training, and gaps in body cam policy enforcement. The officers had entered that room with their body cameras powered on, but not actively recording. Yet the cameras preserved silent video anyway. Without those recordings, investigators would have been left largely with staff accounts of what happened inside the infirmary. At the time this recording was made, 17-year-old Trinity Bostic believed she was spending the day with someone she already knew well. Sitting beside her was Fernando Perales Mejia, also 17, a former boyfriend and classmate whom she had recently reconnected with. For roughly 8 hours that day, the two traveled together across Middle Tennessee. By the end of the night, however, Fernando would be driving this same car alone. This was June 29th, 2024. Earlier that afternoon, Trinity had left her home in Lafayette and met Fernando with plans that went far beyond simply hanging out. Messages recovered later showed that the two had been discussing the idea of running away together and starting somewhere new. Their conversations became increasingly serious, including talk about finding money, stealing a vehicle, and even identifying possible carjacking targets. Interestingly, Fernando's dashcam captured parts of those conversations without either of them apparently treating the camera as important. At one point, Trinity also disabled location tracking on her phone. That fit with the plan she had apparently made to leave home without being immediately found. Later that evening, her father reported her as a runaway, and law enforcement agencies were notified. For the moment, however, there was nothing suggesting to her family that the person traveling beside her would eventually become the focus of a murder investigation. That detail would become far more important once investigators began reconstructing what happened later that night. A 9mm handgun was eventually recovered from underneath the driver's seat of Fernando's car. Investigators said the weapon was consistent with the ammunition and cartridge evidence recovered near Trinity's body. Phone records later showed Trinity and Fernando were together from about 2:30 that afternoon until late that night. Their phones, license plate reader hits, and the GPS-enabled dashcam helped investigators trace portions of the journey through areas around Gallatin, Hendersonville, Lebanon, and toward Nashville. Eventually, the car reached Veterans Parkway near Hendersonville. It was somewhere around this period that the timeline changed completely. The dashcam did not record Trinity's killing. According to prosecutors, Fernando pulled over near Exit 6 sometime between approximately 9:30 and 10 p.m., where Trinity was shot once in the face at close range. Her body was left in a wooded area beside the highway. Investigators later recovered a spent 9mm casing and a live round nearby, while Fernando's phone went offline during a period that overlapped with the estimated time of the shooting. What happened during those missing minutes had not been captured, but what the dashcam recorded afterward created another problem for Fernando. Later recordings showed Fernando driving without Trinity beside him. By then, the two teenagers who had spent much of the day traveling together had separated permanently, although nobody outside the car yet knew why. 4 days later, on July 3rd, workers collecting litter along Veterans Parkway discovered human remains near the roadway. 2 days after that, dental records confirmed they belonged to Trinity. She had been missing for nearly a week. As soon as the discovery went public, Fernando's response became a whole thing. Prosecutors later zeroed in on how he handled it. According to evidence presented at trial, the dashcam captured him smiling and laughing after learning that Trinity's remains had been found. That reaction alone did not prove he had killed her. However, by then, investigators were beginning to uncover far more direct evidence connecting him to Trinity's final day. At first, Fernando told investigators he had not seen Trinity in more than 2 years. That claim quickly became difficult to maintain. Phone records placed their devices together. The dashcam showed Trinity sitting beside him only days earlier, and other cameras had tracked his vehicle during their journey. Once confronted with that evidence, Fernando changed his account and eventually admitted that he had been with Trinity that day. Even then, he denied shooting her and offered different explanations involving another person, but he never confessed. Meanwhile, searches of Fernando's car and home added another layer to the case. Under the driver's seat, investigators found the loaded 9mm handgun. At his home, they recovered Trinity's debit card, clothing, AirPods, and other belongings inside a black bag prepared for the planned runaway. Those items were particularly significant because they were possessions Trinity would likely have needed if she had actually continued on with the plan to disappear. Instead, they had been left behind with Fernando. By July 6th, investigators had gathered enough evidence to arrest Fernando and charge him with Trinity's murder.
We just got to take down everything you say. Go ahead. That's fine right there.
See, I never met you, but you made me stronger. I know there's a piece of craps in the world for real. And you're one of them. When you took that gun to my little kid, and it's probably best if you did it while she was sitting down because she was strong. Well, she put up the picture, but you're gonna get what's coming to you. You put my daughter in heaven, you've been sentenced to hell. That's all I gotta say to you.
All right, thank you, Miss May. General?
Because both teenagers were 17 when the killing occurred, the case initially involved the juvenile system, but Fernando was eventually transferred to adult court. For more than a year, the evidence collected from his phone, his vehicle, the roadside, and particularly his own dashcam remained central to the prosecution. When the case finally went to trial in February 2026, Fernando's own dashcam became one of the most important pieces of evidence shown to the jury. Earlier recordings placed Trinity alive beside him as the two talked and moved through their plans for the day, while another clip captured Fernando handling a firearm inside the car. But as the timeline moved later into the evening, Trinity was no longer in the passenger seat. That change became even harder to explain once prosecutors added the phone location data, the handgun recovered from Fernando's vehicle, Trinity's belongings found at his home, and the different accounts he had given investigators. After 4 days of testimony, the jury began deliberating. Just 25 minutes later, they had reached a verdict. Fernando Perales Mejia was found guilty of first-degree murder on February 26, 2026. Judge D. David Gay immediately sentenced him to life in prison. As of the latest available information, that conviction remains in place. Fernando never admitted to killing Trinity, but his car had quietly recorded hours of their final day together, preserved their conversations, documented evidence prosecutors would later use against him, and eventually allowed a jury to watch portions of a journey that only one of them would return from. At the time, there was nothing obviously disturbing about that moment, but the man covering the camera was 75-year-old David Campbell, and later that same day, someone he had known for years would disappear during an afternoon walk. Brian Lowe was 65 years old and had recently retired after spending more than 2 decades working as a groundsman at Edradinate Estate near Aberfeldy, Scotland. He lived with his longtime partner, Pamela Curran, and regularly walked his black Labrador Millie through the surrounding countryside. On February 16, 2024, Brian left for another of those walks, but he never came home. The following morning, a local man found him lying beside a remote path with Millie still nearby. At first, police believed Brian may have died from a fall or medical problem. Only after a post-mortem examination did they discover that he had actually been shot with a shotgun. Once the investigation changed direction, attention began turning toward Brian's past at the estate. That eventually led investigators to Campbell, who had worked there for decades as the head gamekeeper. Despite spending years at the same property, the two men had a deeply hostile relationship. Witnesses said Campbell believed Brian had once planted evidence against him during investigations involving the illegal poisoning of birds of prey. Over the years, he was also heard openly saying that he loathed Brian. Whatever resentment remained appeared to belong to the past, but investigators later came to believe Campbell had never really let that grievance go. Looking back at the morning Brian died, detectives noticed something unusual around Campbell's home. His CCTV system had been manually disabled, while the Ring doorbell camera was covered with tape more than once during the day. Later that afternoon, cameras elsewhere in the area captured a hooded cyclist traveling toward the countryside where Brian was walking. Investigators believed that the rider was Campbell using his wife's electric bicycle. A bag visible with the cyclist was also considered large enough to carry a shotgun. Meanwhile, data from Brian's phone showed that his movement stopped at around 4:52 p.m., which was close to the time investigators believed he had been killed. There was no recording of the shooting itself, and the murder weapon was never recovered. Instead, the case was built through smaller pieces of evidence. Pellets and ammunition recovered during the investigation were consistent with cartridges found at Campbell's home, while attention also turned toward the e-bike he had apparently used that day. Interestingly, investigators later learned that Campbell had replaced the bike's tires. He claimed the change had simply been a romantic gesture for his wife, although prosecutors questioned that explanation because of when the tires were replaced. After reviewing thousands of hours hours of CCTV, phone data, witness statements, and forensic evidence, investigators concluded that Campbell's movements did not fit his claim that he had remained at home. Ironically, the same doorbell camera Campbell had tried to obscure would later capture more of his behavior. In the weeks after Brian's death, he was recorded speaking dismissively about the investigation and repeatedly making a two-finger gesture toward police. At one point, he described it as giving the fingers to the pollies. None of those remarks proved murder by themselves, but alongside the camera tampering, bicycle footage, old grievance, and reconstructed timeline, they became part of a much larger circumstantial case. 2 years later, Campbell stood trial at the High Court in Glasgow. He denied killing Brian and maintained that the investigation against him had been a monumental shambles.
It may be that given serious errors in the early stages of police inquiries, you thought initially that you had literally got away with murder. David Campbell, you've been found guilty of the murder of James Brian Lowe, known as Brian Lowe, on a quiet country lane near Aberfeldy on 16th February 2024, just over 2 years ago.
I'd wished I could have stood up and said, well, have you ever been told one day your partner's dead and then 4 days later he's been shot and murdered? Would you be thinking straight at these times? When I said I had seen Brian on the Friday night, I fully believed I had, because I always see him when I finish work. But when I realised that he'd lay there all night, I felt really, really bad, because I think, well, if I'd missed him, I'd have went looking for him. And it's really difficult to deal with, because you have so many unanswered questions, like, well, did Brian see the person? Did he die quickly? Things like that.
As for the disabled cameras, Campbell claimed technological confusion rather than an attempt to hide his movements. After hearing the evidence, however, the jury found him guilty of murder by a majority verdict. On February 25, 2026, Campbell was sentenced to life imprisonment and ordered to serve at least 19 years before becoming eligible for parole. His appeal was later refused. Campbell had tried to prevent cameras around his own home from recording where he went that day, but enough footage survived elsewhere for investigators to reconstruct his movements and eventually convince a jury that Brian Lowe's killer was the man trying not to be seen. The camera recording those voices did not belong to either person inside the house. It was mounted at a neighboring property in Riverview, Florida, and during the early hours of October 18, 2019, it quietly captured parts of an argument taking place next door. Several hours later, 25-year-old Matthew Trussler would be found dead beside the swimming pool. Matthew lived at the property with his fiancée, 26-year-old Melissa Turner. The two had been together since 2017 and eventually became engaged before buying the home where the recordings were made. By October 2019, however, both sides would later describe a relationship that had become increasingly difficult, particularly around Matthew's drinking. On the night he died, his blood alcohol level would eventually be measured at an extremely high level. Exactly what happened between them inside the house would become the central question at Melissa's murder trial. What neither of them may have realized was how much of that night had already been preserved. Along with the neighbor's audio, the couple had their own ADT security system operating inside the house. At first, some of the ADT recordings were difficult to place in the correct order because the timestamps were set to a different time zone. Once the footage was placed into the correct sequence, however, it gave them another view of the hours before Matthew died. As that timeline became clearer, prosecutors began arguing that the footage did not fit Melissa's account of being attacked by an armed and uncontrollable Matthew. In portions of the footage, Matthew appeared relatively calm and was not visibly carrying a weapon, while Melissa's movements were presented by the prosecution as evidence that she was pursuing the confrontation rather than trying to escape from it. The defense strongly disagreed with that interpretation, and because there was no camera covering the exact location where the stabbing occurred, neither side could simply point to one recording and say it showed the entire event. Those words became much harder for Melissa to explain once the case reached court. The neighbor's camera also picked up crashing sounds, breaking glass, and later what appeared to be Melissa asking herself, Taken alone, audio from outside a house could not establish precisely what was happening inside. But when investigators compared it with the ADT footage and the physical evidence, a timeline began to form. Melissa maintained that Matthew had become extremely intoxicated and violent. In her account, he woke her during the night, eventually choked her, slammed her head, and confronted her with a tactical knife. She said she grabbed at the blade, cutting her hand, and stabbed him once in the back while trying to escape. Afterward, Melissa claimed she either lost consciousness or had significant gaps in her memory because of the blow to her head. For a while, that was the explanation she maintained for why she could not clearly describe everything that followed. The medical evidence, however, showed that Matthew had suffered more than a single superficial stab wound. Along with the wound to his back, he had cuts to his chest and shoulder, defensive injuries to his forearm, and a severe wound to his arm that had opened a major vein. Ultimately, it was blood loss from that arm injury that caused his death. As for Melissa, investigators documented a significant cut to her hand, but prosecutors argued there was little physical evidence supporting the level of strangulation or head trauma she described. There was also the matter of time. Much of the confrontation appeared to have taken place around 4 a.m., yet Melissa did not call 911 until approximately 8:30 that morning. During those intervening hours, Matthew remained badly injured. At around 5:11 a.m., the security footage appeared to show him moving toward the pool area where his body would later be found. By the time Melissa finally contacted emergency services, nothing could be done to save him. Melissa initially told authorities that she had found Matthew unresponsive after a night of drinking, but as detectives gathered the neighbors' recordings and reconstructed the ADT footage, her account began facing increasingly difficult questions. Eventually, she was arrested and charged with second-degree murder with a weapon. When Melissa went to trial in February 2022, the case came down to two very different interpretations of the same night. Her defense argued that Matthew's extreme intoxication and alleged aggression had placed Melissa in genuine fear for her life. They also questioned the way portions of the neighbor's audio had been processed, arguing that Melissa's voice had been amplified while Matthew's was much harder to hear.
I didn't do what they're saying. I did. If I'm going to prison, then I'm going down fighting. I'm going down telling my side of the story.
Prosecutors, meanwhile, relied heavily on the security recordings, Matthew's defensive wounds, the delay before calling 911, and the changes they said appeared in Melissa's story as more evidence was shown to her. In their account, Melissa had been the aggressor and then left Matthew bleeding for hours. After roughly 7 hours of deliberation, the jury rejected Melissa's claim of self-defense. She was found guilty of second-degree murder with a weapon. A month later, on March 18, 2022, she returned to court for sentencing. The prosecution had sought a substantially longer sentence, but the judge ultimately ordered Melissa to serve 20.5 years in prison. Her conviction was later upheld on appeal in 2024. As of the latest information available, she remains incarcerated, with a projected release date in early 2042. No camera captured the exact moment Matthew was stabbed, but cameras inside the house and at the property next door had preserved the hours surrounding his death from two different perspectives. Melissa later gave jurors her account of what happened when nobody else was in the room. If you stayed till here, thank you so much. If you have any suggestions or a case you want me to cover next, just drop it in the comments.